Well, welcome to the Good Word on Marriage, Bill McGurn's breakout session. Bill McGurn is a vice president for News Corporation and writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal called Main Street. He's also a former chief speechwriter to President George W. Bush. Most of Bill's career has been spent in journalism. He was chief editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal and spent more than 10 years overseas in Europe and Asia for Dow Jones Publications. In the early 1990s, he also served as Washington bureau chief for National Review. Bill is author of Perfidious Albion, The Abandonment of Hong Kong, 1997, as well as a monograph on terrorism. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Bill holds degrees from the University of Notre Dame and Boston University, is married to the former Julie Hoffman, and has 3 daughters, Grace, Maisie, and Lucy. And it's been a pleasure to be in touch with Bill as we've prepared for this. I'm very pleased to present him to you. He's going to answer some great questions for you today.
Thank you for those words. Can everyone hear me? I'm very pleased to be here at Princeton today. It's a beautiful campus, and I'm particularly pleased to be here with the Love and Fidelity Network. You've set a very high bar for yourselves to defend the goods of marriage, family, and chastity. In the years since you've started up the Love and Fidelity Network, you've inspired many other college students on many other campuses to do the same. And even among your critics who don't share your values, you have earned a reputation for rigor and reasoned argument. Today, you are truly the counterculture on our campuses. I'd also like to say that apparently Princeton is getting the message. And how do I know this? Recently, I read in the campus newspaper that Steve Carell has been invited to speak at next spring's class day. Mr. Carell may not be Elizabeth Anscombe. He did, however, star in the 40-year-old version. And at least for now, that's probably as close as mainstream Princeton is going to get to a celebration of intimacy within marriage. When I was invited here, I was told that what most of you at this session are interested in is learning how to better communicate the truth about marriage, family, and sexuality to your college peers, especially through your writing. And as I focused on this question, a lot of what I originally planned to say changed quite a bit. So let me outline what I will be talking about. First, I want to spend a little time on why people like you provoke such a commotion on our campuses these days. Second, I want to suggest that what you are really offering your peers is a way of life more consistent with health, happiness, and human dignity, not simply a litany of sexual no's. Finally, I will suggest some ways that you might help use your persuasive powers to bring your message to our campuses. The way I think of it is this: your job is to help a Kim Kardashian world regain its fluency in Audrey Hepburn. So let's start with the beginning. As an outsider, to me, I find universities today very funny places. In theory, they're institutions that open up young minds, insist on rational argument, and cherish civil debate. In practice, you know more about it than I do, and it's not always that way. Most college administrators today would tell you that they've long since left in loco parentis behind. That's not entirely true, however. These days, our colleges and universities go to great lengths to insulate you from influences thought to be harmful and to promote those believed to be beneficial. For example, yesterday, just before I left for this conference, I Googled the phrase "banned from campus." And I learned that across the United States, various universities have banned secondhand smoke, the incandescent light bulb, bottled water, plastic bags, fraternities, Red Bull, ROTC, Native American mascots, certain forms of speech, and at least at one state university in California, a Christian student group. On the flip side, there are some things that our universities actively promote. Many years ago, Irving Kristol wrote, quote, "A liberal is a person who sees a 14-year-old girl performing sex acts on stage and wonders if she's being paid the minimum wage." Today, Irving would note that the only question we would ask our young ladies is whether they were insisting their partners use condoms. It's a curious thing to me, this absolute faith in the condom. Centuries from now, it's possible to imagine an anthropologist studying daily life on an American campus in the 21st century and coming to the conclusion that we worship latex. Our anthropologists, for example, would find that the Daily Princetonian recently devoted an article to this ministry by reporting on the availability of said prophylactic on this campus. It turns out that there are at least 7 outlets, and one of them, the McCosh Health Center, restricts students to a 10-condom-a-day allowance. This commitment for Princeton appears to be paying off in the ratings. Just the other day, Trojan brand condoms announced that Princeton had moved from 8th place to 3rd place in its annual ratings. Now let's be fair. Notwithstanding this impressive showing on the Trojan rankings, it strikes me that Princeton is no worse than any other American college. At most of these campuses, people like you would be considered somewhat exotic. So one might think that at least in the name of diversity, you would be encouraged to make your own choices, right? Well, not quite. An English major can graduate from Princeton without ever having read Shakespeare, but not without having sat through a required series of skits called Sex on a Saturday Night. Porn stars lecture during Yale's Sex Week, but let an Orthodox Jewish woman ask to live off campus because she prefers not to share her showers with strange men, and she is refused. And on it goes relentlessly, with much hostility to any poor soul such as yourselves who tries to resist. That itself is a very telling note. In a truly libertarian environment, no one ought to care if a man decides that multiple partners are not for him, or a woman declares her belief that she will find her fulfillment in marriage and family. From your own experience, however, you know that people do care very much, and they're quick to put down this kind of talk. Why hostility and not simply indifference? The answer is that the sexual orthodoxy that prevails on most campuses today is like most brittle ideologies. It cannot tolerate dissent. It cannot tolerate dissent because its advocates know that deep down what they offer is fundamentally unsatisfying. If, for example, sexuality were merely a physical act of little consequence apart from avoiding disease or pregnancy, it doesn't explain why we feel such a sense of betrayal over infidelity. If marriage were simply a piece of paper between 2 consenting adults, it doesn't explain the devastation of divorce. Another way of putting it is this: if sex were really not the big deal that it is, college students would not have to be so stinking drunk before going back to someone's room for a hookup. Do not take my word for it. Ask any young man who has tried to weasel out of a relationship that changed in some undefinable way after a night of physical passion. Ask any young woman who has watched a man get up from her bed in the morning and wonder to herself if she will ever hear from him again. For so many people on campus today, physical intimacy has become the first step in whether a relationship should begin at all, rather than the culminating act of love and commitment. In this environment, the man or woman like you who stands up and declares, "I dissent," can be profoundly discomforting. It is discomforting precisely because all sides understand that by dissenting, you are saying that the prevailing orthodoxy is false, that there is a better path to a happy and fulfilling life. That is a radical stand, and an unpopular stand, on most college campuses today. And like all radicals willing to accept the consequences of their principles, you inspire a mix of fear and admiration. This leads to my second point. What your harshest critics fear most is that you may be right, or at least that others might find your message attractive. In the popular depiction, you are the party of no premarital sex, no sex outside marriage, certainly no homosexual sex. It is no coincidence that when you first popped up in the New York Times, the headline read as follows, quote, "A group at Princeton where no means entirely no." That is the caricature. Every man and woman in this room knows it better than I do. And if you have been at it for any amount of time, you know that the rejoinder to your propositions will more likely be ridicule than argument. The ridicule, however, cannot hide something that you have and that our sexual ethos has mostly killed: romance. There's a reason that all the great romantic movies were made long ago. Romance feeds on possibility and withers when the outcome is a foregone conclusion. Romance also requires the drama that comes from the sense that what is at stake is something permanent, that the object of your affection may be the one meant for you and for you only. We see this in film. 50 years from now, people will still be reading Abelard and Heloise and still watching Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr in An Affair to Remember. Will anyone remember Sex and the City? Let me put it this way. I sometimes wonder whether we now have a whole generation wondering what happened to things they know about only from books and old movies. Moonlight evenings, candlelit dinners for two, and the thrill of a first kiss. In its place, at least on campuses, we have sexperts in sex magazines. At Boston University, Newsweek recently interviewed a young woman who edits a sex magazine called, appropriately enough, Boink. For the first issue, our young editoress posed nude. Alas, it turns out that her peers are not as progressive as she supposed. Quote, "Everyone assumes because of the magazine that I'm sleeping with everything that walks," she complained to Newsweek. Where, I ask you, would they ever get an idea like that? Now, our young people may in fact believe what everything around you screams, that the conventional wisdom of yesteryear was based on harsh and unrealistic expectations about human behavior, especially in the realm of sexuality. But I'm curious, would it not be arresting to survey unmarried women about your age and ask them this question? How many of you believe that the man you marry will remain by your side till death you do part? What would you give for such a man? Forget that. What would you give for a plain, old-fashioned date? Flowers, dinner, and a movie. The answers would likely be surprising. Not to your grandmothers, perhaps, but surely to the bright young things at Boink. So how do you communicate about sexuality? In that same New York Times piece I mentioned earlier, a Princeton spokesman put it this way, quote, "The university does not take a position on the sex lives of our students, but we do take care to make them aware of health and safety issues," unquote. In other words, for the most part, we talk about sexual activity with technical advice, such as workshops on how to put a condom over a banana, or referrals to websites that allow students to find out the clinical details before they submit to their partner's more ultra-sexual demands. As it happens, of all the ways to talk about sex, the clinical and the physical strike me as the least practical. Sex is powerful because its consequences are by no means limited to the physical. It makes rational men and women irrational. It ties us to people when we would rather be free. And in the right circumstances, it gives us a glimmer of the divine. In a better world, men and women who are more learned and more experienced than you would guide you here, by example no less than instruction. Unfortunately, for the most part, the people who should know better either don't know better or fear the consequences of questioning this reigning orthodoxy. That means it is left to you, the students, to work your way through the thicket to become the teachers yourselves. How do you do it? And especially, how do you do it in writing? I sense some urgency in the way you ask that question. This is a tribute to your good hearts and to your willingness to do what it takes to succeed. Still, we must begin at the beginning, and here the beginning is this. You must start out recognizing that you will likely fail. That is to say, you must give up the idea, if you ever had it, that the answer is some irrefutable argument, some perfect way of putting these things, some wittily written blog post. This is not how people change their minds, and it's not how we change a culture. The truth is that the work you are engaged in is the work of generations. People who read what you write are not looking for arguments or proofs. They look to you because they are in some important ways dissatisfied with what they are being told, even if they cannot fully explain why. What they are looking to you for is some sense of hope. Men and women are not so much won by argument as persuaded by example. I would say the same thing when people ask me what makes a good speech. The most powerful speeches come when the message and the messenger are consonant with one another. Another way of putting it is this: walking the walk is as important as talking the talk. This does not mean that you must live unblemished saintly lives before you can speak. Sex and desire are as real for those who believe in chastity and marriage as for those who believe anything goes. That means that though the restraint and integrity we ask may be better, they are also indisputably harder. At times, the happy portraits we paint of marriage and the chaste lifestyle can be as false and unrealistic as the Panglossian promises about sex untethered from feeling and moral consideration. Our most important choices and commitments, if we're honest with ourselves, are all challenges. The struggle is inseparable from the message and part of what makes sticking it out so rewarding. We do a disservice to our friends to pretend that it is easy, that there are no costs, or that there are not disappointments along the way. This is especially true, I think, for the young. The young are quick to spot phoniness or something that does not ring true. When you write to persuade, you must put yourself in the place of those on the receiving end, to know his insecurities, to understand her sensitivities, to appreciate the pressures and obstacles they face, even when they might agree with you. In this, however, you have a tremendous advantage. You are the same age, going through the same things. You can relate. The more you read yourself from those who have given great thought to these questions, the more you understand your arguments. The more you see the unity of these many disparate issues, the better you will be at countering the thin gruel with which we now feed our young. Your challenge is to take these ideas, some of them quite abstract and removed from the considerations of college students, and apply them in a way that your peers can relate to. Quite literally, no one can do this better than you can. You must also recognize what success is likely to look like. No one is going to be convinced by a blog post or an article for the campus paper, no matter how thoughtful or well written. If you expect that, you will only be building disappointment for yourselves. The great gift you have to offer is to let people know that there is a different point of view. For many, that point of view will come across as alien and even irritating. We believe, however, that it is a point of view that has human nature on its side, and that should give you some confidence. Above all, you must tell stories. Honest stories, yes, but with something as human as sexual intimacy, where the message is that our partners are more than means to our individual ends, we must remember that the human drama is at the heart of this. The culture we have, after all, was not imposed by a dry philosophic tome. The culture we have is as old as the story of the apple and the tree, a false, attractive promise that if we behave in such a way, we shall be as the gods. It is a message that comes to us through film, fiction, and television, has been encouraged by music, and has now become what President Obama might call the narrative of our time. In such an environment, you must tell your own stories, honest stories, stories that admit of unhappy endings, even when people do the right thing. Your writing will attract not so much by how you tell the story, by what you show, where people who read your work will recognize, as they do with all honest tales, their own selves, their own hopes, and their own fears in between the lines. As you do this, many will dismiss you as conventional, a return to the bad old days. That is inevitable. It helps to remember that once what we call the conventional, at least at one time, became the conventional for a reason. The conventional, after all, represents the accumulated wisdom about human nature drawn from experience. In other words, it is the kind of wisdom you will always find in a Frank Sinatra lyric, but seldom in a New York Times op-ed. My young friends, yours is a very lonely charge. You live in a world forged by people who were taught to defy authority and who are now authorities themselves. You are students doing the work of teachers. In the course of your good work, you will make many mistakes in what you say, in how you say it, in when you say it. If you are honest about these mistakes, they will provide you with the best lessons you will ever learn for how to communicate what you want to say in a way that breaks through to others and reaches their hearts. So my advice to you, especially as writers, is this. Embrace the scandal of your beliefs. Take mockery as a tribute to your message. Remember that there is something powerful about a young woman or a young man who dissents from the received orthodoxies of our age and is not embarrassed to say so. Above all, remember that there is something deeply attractive about it too. If you do these things, you will not change the sexual ethos of our time. You may not even change many minds. You will, however, let professors and students know that there is another view than the one that prevails, that this view hangs together intellectually, that it can be defended by reason. Most of all, for those finding their pursuit of happiness is not bringing them to where they hope to be, you give them something invaluable, a place to look for it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer more specific questions, especially about writing. Any questions?
That reading more ourselves will help us be able to better form our arguments. Do you have specific recommendations?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some here. I think if you find one place, like the Love and Fidelity Network, and you look at the speakers, you'll see that they've written on a lot of other things. You probably heard some people, and you can Google them and find other things. I mean, the arguments are there. No one that's arguing for marriage is coming up with their own argument. They may come up with a better way of explaining it or a way that appeals to you more. But I don't think it's that hard. I mean, you're all smart people. Usually if you find one person and they will lead you to other groups and organizations that kind of share your values and so forth. So there's I'd start with people here. I mean, you had Helen Alvarez and some of the other professors. You know, some of you will have different interests in it. You know, some of the men might have different interests from some of the women. But I think there's no shortage of experts in finding out, you know, what we believe. We just heard about the economic benefits, you know, of marriage. I mean, I think if we're right and our view hangs together, Of course there'd be economic benefits, because if you do the right thing, we look at the human being holistically. And of course all these things make sense and so forth. So, you kind of find one thread and you trace it back, you'll find a lot of other things. And today, with the internet, you can find anything. Your various churches have different teachings. And the more you read one, when you read the next one, you'll understand more. It will come to you in your own way, as you would with any other subject. I would suggest just find your own interest. Google what you're interested for, and you'll see. And sometimes reading the stuff you don't agree with, that's a good way to understand. I don't really accept this, but my impression is that for most of you, that's all around you. So that's not hard to find. It's a little harder to find the kind of people that you're looking for. But there are all sorts of institutes on marriage. There are all sorts of conferences everywhere. So there's just no shortage of essays or people writing on the issues.
Bill, I just want to follow up on that to let everybody know that right on the Love and Fidelity website, we're building a really extensive library of resources, so that's a good place to start. And also the Witherspoon Institute has an online newsletter called The Public Discourse.
Right.
And if you go on there, you can search for the marriage and family part, and that's a wonderful place to start.
And I looked at the blog before I came because I didn't want to come and talk about editing, what technical things about editing. I think the blog is pretty good. And if you see a student, at the University of New Mexico explains it there, you're probably going to relate to them in some way. So you can learn a lot from each other and so forth. I thought most of the things were written pretty well. I mean, most of you are not under any illusion that you represent the majority. So you're used to dealing with people that disagree with you. You're not the orthodoxy where you go out in the world and you assume everyone agrees. And that's a big step for argument, because if you want to argue, if you want to persuade, you have to not only understand your argument, you have to understand their argument and where they're coming from. And when you talk to your peers, you have to realize they haven't assented to an argument. They're part of a culture that has all these other influences on them. So they're not going to say, aha, that's a great essay, I now agree with you. One of the examples is, I always think cigarettes is a good example. We've had warnings on cigarettes since I was a child. People still smoke. It's still a huge industry, and it tells you it's going to kill you, and I think they're putting on a more gruesome warning pretty soon. What really hurt cigarettes was when they became unfashionable, not when they not health things. So, it used to be in the old movies that I mentioned, cigarettes were very much a part of glamour and so forth, and now you don't see them. So I think Oscar Wilde said the way to eliminate something is to not make it illegal or immoral, but to make it unfashionable, and that holds for cigarettes. And I think you have to realize that people are asking you, and I mean this very literally, they're in some ways just not finding the satisfaction in what they're told, and that's almost a crime today. In a country where the pursuit of happiness is in our declaration, if you're unhappy, it's almost the worst sin. And they may not understand why, but we believe we know why, because human nature, even for men, we know, it looks like a sexual paradise if you can have as many partners and so forth when you're young. But if you look at some of the statistics on health, unmarried men don't live as long, aren't as happy, all sorts of things, you can find this. So I think when people are coming to you, there's some part that's not fulfilled, and they're not necessarily going to embrace what you say, but what you have to offer them is to say, not I have this argument, you're doing this wrong, but I have a completely different way of looking at the human person and the world. And that can be very discomforting for someone, but it gets them to think. And again, you have to not expect that they're going to agree with you. If you do your jobs really well, what's likely to happen if they do agree with you is that when they're in some situation later in life and they're looking for a way out, they might remember a glimmer of what you said and kind of pull the threads themselves and work their way back, from this little piece of string. And I think that's what you really have to offer. There's a whole world against you in a culture and so forth. What you can show is that there's a different world, there's a different way to be. It's a very radical message today. Any other?
What has been your experience with opposition in regards to
You mean people disagreeing? Yeah, I have a lot of people that disagree with me. And most of my email is people telling me I'm stupid or this or that. But it's very telling. Now writers get a lot more feedback because even when you write for a print publication, they have your email or you have comments at the end of an article. I tend not to look at the comments at the end of an article because what usually happens is that the people that are commenting get in side wars with each other, going back and forth. But they do send letters to me, and I find that sometimes people have a thoughtful objection. I would say about a third of the time they are just obscene or something, and I usually, write back, "Is that your argument?" And you know what's surprising? About a third of the time, maybe a third to a half, some people will write back and apologize and say, I didn't think anyone would ever read this, so I just sent it off. And then you can talk to them, So it's very varied. I think that's why, like, if I looked for my satisfaction from someone that said, "You know what? I used to believe this. You're so brilliant. I read that. Now I agree with you," I'd be a very unhappy person. So I think what I try to do is take people that disagree out of their comfort zone and try to do it by trying to find an angle of writing that is not what they expect and go into their central premises and so forth. And at the same time, for people that do agree, who sometimes feel very alone and embattled, I get a lot of email for them that's more in the line of thanks for doing this or thanks for doing that. Sometimes here's another article you might look at. It's just a lot of your expectations, and that's what I'm saying. I don't want you to be disappointed because people are not going to take it kindly. And a lot of people, especially young people, write very strong things, and then they're surprised if they get very strong reaction and so forth. So, and I think it helps to be funny. Someone recently kept writing me, and he actually CC'd a group of people at the Journal. And I don't think it was on any particular column I wrote, but he sensed I disagree with him. And he didn't sign his name. He had his email, the email's on there, of course. And he started with an explicative. And then he went on, and then he went into some anti-Semitic ravings and stuff. So I emailed him back and copied everyone on, and I said, first of all, I took his email and I Googled it, and I found a name. And I realized who he was, and he had a responsible job at a hospital in Pennsylvania. And I just emailed him back saying, "Dear Mr. So-and-so," using his name, his last name, "someone seems to have stolen your email and is sending around vulgar rants and anti-Semitic screeds. I thought you should know." And I haven't heard from him since. And that's another thing I'd say, a sense of humor, especially for you guys, because you guys are portrayed as uptight and, you don't want anyone to have fun and that sort of stuff. A sense of humor goes a long way. It'll be helpful for you, but a sense of humor generally shows a confidence in your view. The people that are notoriously short of sense of humor are the people who really aren't sure of themselves in some way. So it'll help you both in your writing and just in the disappointments and in some of the startling reaction and very hostile reaction you'll get from people. And even from people, professors and so forth that you would expect would be a little more nurturing, or put it one way.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, what are some responses that you've gotten from editors as far as are there ever any clashes of them not wanting or not liking something?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of luxury at the Journal because I'm pretty free to write what I want, but I didn't get a column until I was 50 years old. I wrote editorials for a long time, and then I wrote speeches in someone else's name. So, one reason Paul Jago asked me to do the column is because he knew I wrote pretty well. So I generally get the benefit of the doubt. When I get a question, it's more, I don't understand this, or this seems to be a contradiction. And it's very easy to get huffy and say, "Oh, you're an idiot," and so forth. But my approach generally is that if someone, even if they've totally misread what I've said, if they've done that, my impression is a lot of the readers will do that too. So it's worth putting aside your huffiness and saying, okay, and trying to fix it even. I tend to try to accommodate, even if I think it was better or more clever the first way. Because I think that they're speaking up for other people that don't don't know. And the other thing I've learned, it is unbelievable how much people can misunderstand what you say, and in fact reach the exact opposite conclusion of what you can have a sentence saying, the color is red, and people say, why are you writing that the color is blue? And it's amazing what people have. So anything that you can do to work with someone to make it more clear, I think is a good thing. I think it's always good to work for clarity. I'm also a less is more person. I'm always willing to cut, because I think, was it Truman who said, if you wanted me to give you a speech that was 15 minutes long, it'll take me a month to prepare. If you want me to give you a speech that's a half an hour, it'll take me 2 weeks. If you want a speech more than an hour, I can do it right away. The real discipline of writing, and I see this with a lot of young, is knowing what to leave out, to be willing to cut your stuff, to sharpen stuff all the time, to go over it, and you'll do that. But in your case, in addition to that, I think with your arguments, you're trying to make, you just really have to know the other person who you're writing to, and people are going to behave badly, because the other thing is, people take it when you say, this is a better way. If people are behaving in a different way, they take it as a real judgment on themselves. It can sound like you're condemning them. In my church, we say we hate the sin and love the sinner. My experience is a lot of the sinners don't see it that way, and they get very, very angry at this. And it's a sensitivity that you have to keep in mind. As far as I can see from the blog that you have, you're pretty well aware of it, because you live with these people and you're around them, and and you don't want to offend. So, you'll just learn a lot by experience.
There seems to be fairly, from my general experience, there's a misconception in general, I can call it culture, especially where our views are actually the majority of opinion. That's supposed to be put out in the media. And it's the contrary. And I know News Corporation is one of the biggest boogeymen behind that.
Mm-hmm.
But so I found that a lot of times it is something that's been these topics from all others, people just dismissing how
Right. Right. Right.
So in terms of writing, really the most effective method we have of trying to get our message out, and in a lot of cases we will not be read. That's what I'm saying.
I think there's no good. First of all, you don't choose the moment of battle; it comes to you. That's it's like you don't choose the army. You got to go with what you have at the time. And people are always fighting that I've never seen the perfect war at the perfect time. It never happens. People are never ready. It's how you respond. In some ways we have the worst of both worlds, where people attack our view as though it's the dominant view, where in fact it's not the dominant view, but we have the burden of looking like we're representing the establishment point of view, and the establishment is closer to Princeton University than it is to us. It's just very difficult. I think you have to have confidence. I think you have to read, and also you'll grow in your lives. I mean, one of the difficulties you have, frankly, is that you're young. I mean, it's one of your advantages in relating to your other people. But, I would write very differently now as the father of 3 girls than I would have written 25 years ago. I would have had the same values. It's not that my values have changed. I just see it in different, deeper ways and so forth. So it's almost a little presumptuous of young people to write and instruct other people on marriage and family when you aren't married and you don't, for the most part, have families. But that doesn't, you still have your learning within your group. I think most of you, my guess is, some of you will have come from, tasting, other lifestyles that were unsatisfying. But my suspicion is that most of you come from families where you were inculcated with this view of marriage and family and what it should be, and you find it a great source of comfort in some ways. And I think that's what people are looking for. I mean, that's really where your learning came from. I mean, my guess is for most of you, if you believe in traditional concepts of sexuality and morality and family, it came from your own families, or from someone you admired close to your family, very close in your life. And that's what you have to be, for other people, and so forth. And as I say, sometimes you'll never know. I think it's a lot like raising a child. People say, I don't know what the heck my kids are going to do, and I hope they'll do well, but I won't know for a long time whether anything I've ever said to them takes. You'll know in different instances when they're later and how they choose whom to date and so forth, but you don't know. But what you hope is, I hope that when they find themselves at a difficult part in their life, people fall in love with the wrong person. People fall in love with the wrong person all the time, or we wouldn't have literature. And they even know it's the wrong person. And I don't exclude myself from that. I'm very happy with my wife. But in my life, I've gone through things where I've really had strong feelings for someone that I even knew was not good. And it's just like those warning things on the cigarettes. The rational isn't the total package. Pascal said the heart has reasons of which the mind knows nothing. And that's really true. So when you're writing to people, you're dealing not only with their heads, but their hearts. And that's why I think stories, if they're reading what you say, they're testing it as they read it. Because first of all, they probably start out with skepticism, thinking, what is this person? I'm not into it. And then they're reading it, and they say, oh, this is BS. But if they read it and they say, that's me, I had that fear. Or that's me, I understand that feeling. I mean, that's why sometimes literature is more realistic than which the great novels or the reality shows on TV, which are more realistic. We say a novel is great because it's a story, and the story illustrates something that's true. And when the stories are cheap, or they cheat, in some ways, or they imply there's all happy endings, they don't work. And so your job is to be honest, and to be honest with the difficulties. And I think that will get past people who say this is just BS. They're testing you with every word you say this way. And sometimes they'll attribute, bad intentions to you when you don't have them. And I think it's like anything. If you're a parent or you have someone you love that has a difficult thing, you stick with them through that because you believe in them and hope they'll come around. And the most you can do is hope that what they get from you is that there is this other way of living. And it's very different, and it can be very attractive. It's a challenge, but it's out there. And then they might go discover it quietly on their own.
What is the balance between telling honest stories and not saying things that people will be able to say, oh, well, that's just your personal experience, that doesn't apply to everybody.
Right.
Or that's an exception.
Right. Well, that's what they will say. I mean, I think one of my messages is you can't stop them from saying what they're going to say, and even unfair things, and say, oh, okay, or they'll say that's not realistic. I don't know anyone. The constant attitude is, okay, you can't expect college kids to stop having sex. So anything you say that implies the slightest bit of restraint is unrealistic. I think that's unrealistic too. If you're gonna solve a problem, that's where it gets back to confidence. You can't worry about what your critics say. You can't worry about that. What you can worry about is if you're trying to persuade a friend and they take it the wrong way, and you can try to see, is there a better to think about? Could I have said that better? I mean, we do this all the time. With our families and so forth. I think of it all the time. And I think of it in articles. Sometimes people will misread something that I wrote, and I wish, now having heard how this person took it, I would have put it a little bit differently. But even so, you're not going to solve that, because that's what they want to do. You have to, especially for you people here, they don't want to debate you. They want to dismiss it out of hand. They don't want to hear you. They don't want to have voice. So they're not going to say, I disagree with this point or that point. They're going to say it has no relevance today or something. That's what I mean. They don't want to debate. They're afraid of a debate because a lot of them can't debate their propositions. And so they'll end up mocking you. Oh, you're just a prude. You don't want fun or this or that. And you just have to be ready for that. That's if you've chosen these values, that's your life. And it's going to be your life outside Princeton too. In some ways, and you just have to be ready for it, and try not to let yourself get bothered by it. I mean, look at your parents. If you have parents, if they've raised you in any of these values, they've put up with a lot of this and worse. And, why do you love them? Because they're kind of confident in who they are. They're not afraid. The classic, you have a defense, oh, Sally's doing it. If Sally jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge, would you do it, And you find out, actually, a lot of people would jump off the Brooklyn Bridge if the other people did it. But the people that you respect are the people that say, no, I have a different point of view. What you want to be is more respected than necessarily liked, in a way. And a lot of this likeness is false. You don't want to offend needlessly. I think especially here to make a point, you can make a point at someone's expense, but I think it gets harder to reach their hearts if you do that, because when you're touching on sexual intimacy and behavior, you're cutting very close to a person's definition of himself. I mean, they're immediately going to say, oh, he's condemning me, or she's condemning me. And that's a very hard thing to do, but you'll learn it. I mean, it's a social skill. You learn it with your friends. You learn how to bring up things to different people.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question along those guidelines. Just, especially you were addressing how strong viewpoints are always helpful because they get your point across, but also in a setting like on a college campus when you are addressing so many different people that have so many different beliefs. I mean, what exactly, how far would you apologize in something you were writing, or would you kind of address the other viewpoint, or would you recommend focusing mainly just on your perspective?
No, I think you can't focus on your perspective. Like, in my world, the newspapers, the biggest mistake people make is they focus on what they want to say. And I focus on who is my reader, who's reading my article. And my assumption with every column that I write, I have a lot of fans that read it every week and say, I loved it this week again. But I'm really trying to reach people that read me because they find it interesting. They're mildly or wildly skeptical, and they'll come back at me or something, but they find it interesting. And I'm kind of engaging them to think about a question, whether it's population or something, outside the framework from how they've thought it. I think if you obsess too much about your own point of view, you will not persuade. To persuade someone else, I have to know what you like and this. If I'm trying to get someone to, go out to dinner with me, I mean, not even a date, just someone, if I'm proposing Chinese food and they hate Chinese food, I'm not going to have a lot of luck. So you gotta, you have to know who you're doing. When I write an article, I'm imagining readers. This week I wrote an article on actually the value of a college degree. And it's a subject that a lot of people write on. There's a lot of different measures. There's a lot of different questions about it. And in terms of packaging it, I was saying that I was provoked by it because I looked on the We Are the 99% webpage, and a lot of them talked about their college loans and what a ripoff it was. And I actually think that a lot of them have a point. A lot of them have been ripped off in the sense that their colleges didn't demand anything from them. So they've got a sham degree. My point is, if you get a real degree from any university that's real, you'll have grown in learning and so forth. It's a worthwhile investment and so forth. Anyway, it came to the headline, and one of the editors wanted to write Occupy Wall Street as a point. And I said, I don't mind that as a sub-headline, but I think it should be, what's your kid getting out of college? Because our readers are people closer to my age than your age. And they all have kids either in high school or in college or just out, and they're all wondering, is it worth it? Are they majoring in the right thing? And of course, it was the second most read story in the Wall Street Journal. I think a lot of that was not necessarily how I wrote it, but the headline. So I think when you write, you have to have a person in mind. I have to be thinking of you as when I'm writing, just a peer. So you can't write for everyone on Princeton. Just imagine someone that you think is fairly typical and write for that person. You can't write for the general thing. If you write too general, it'll just have no flavor. So just imagine, if you're writing, like if you have a roommate that doesn't believe anything you believe in, write for that roommate. If they're write for that's what like what they're going to say. So you have to imagine, I mean, the biggest failing in writing is people don't imagine the readers. You know, they're so intent, I want to say this is how I say it, and they don't think of who's reading it. And the biggest thing is to imagine your readers, you know. My boss, Rupert Murdoch, always says, there are editors all around the country and they think that technology's killing their paper. And they're killing their paper because they're trying to win awards rather than win readers. And they have no idea their readers' interests, you know. If you're in a small town paper, your readers have mortgages, they're worried about the schools, all sorts of things. And a lot of the editors worry about things that will get them prizes, but have nothing to do with what their readers want to read about. You know, I constantly look at what the most popular stories, when I came down here and reading the Princetonian, I was reading what are the most popular, what are those kids clicking on? You know, what are people commenting on? So really imagine a specific reader, and if it's a roommate, imagine your roommate. That you'll be better for trying to persuade that person. You know, especially if you're making an argument.
I have time for this one more question.
Okay.
Okay, well, you mentioned humor and personal stories as kind of rhetorical strategies. From your experience, did you have any other sort of helpful points to work from?
Yeah, one is, unless you're really good at it, don't try sarcasm, because my experience is college kids aren't that good at it. People get really offended and so forth. The humor that works the best, like anything, and it works in politics, is a self-sense of humor a little bit. Just don't take yourselves as seriously. That makes you a lot more attractive. That makes you attractive, you know, when you speak. I mean, President Bush, when I wrote for him, when we went to colleges for commencement, he always had jokes about himself, you know. We had something, I think he went to Calvin College, and he said that, one of the English professors said, turn out to see George Bush, and you will learn lessons about English you never believed you would learn. So, he had a lot, if you read his speeches, there's a lot of things, and that's part of, establishing a rapport. If you're, by definition, you're young, and you're professor, you're writing something, and you can come across the vice young as a know-it-all, or just, too big for yourself. And people, especially people that are looking to be persuaded, you have to humanize yourself a little, so have a little sense of humor. Don't get so mad. Like when I respond to people in the email, I try, if I can, to concede a point to them. Like they'll say, you missed this, and I'll say, I frequently start the letter with fair point, but here's why I was thinking of it. But just to not say, to always answer, dear someone, say, here's why you're stupid and why I'm so smart. Sometimes I feel like writing that, but that's not the best way. And and frankly, I learned from it because they come back and people appreciate. I told you a lot of times I write to someone that writes really vulgar things, and I would say at least a third of the time I get a thing back saying, I apologize. I didn't think anyone, I just was a hot, it's easy to, you read an article, you're mad, to dash off an email and so forth. So I can, if someone apologizes, what more can you ask from them? They've done the right thing, and you do learn from those people. So, your key is to try to express your views with integrity, and people have to see that it's kind of with your life, and not so self-righteous, and to offer that, that this is a different view to other people, and to know that it's going to be really hard for people to accept your view. For one thing, it makes a lot more demands on you. If you have to have restraint, it makes demands. It makes demands in terms of social popularity and so forth. And it helps if you don't care about those things a lot. And probably most of you don't, but you probably know a lot of your peers do. And frankly, a lot of your professors do. A lot of your professors do know better, but they're just afraid to say so. And that puts a big burden on you guys. But, so you have a lot of strikes against you. You're not experienced, you're not parents, but you have a lot of things for you. You're writing for people your age with your interests in your environment. Those are your strengths. Use your assets. And if it is your roommate or your best friend and they're doing something, write about it the way you would write to that person. What would you do to someone you really cared about, to write it this way? I think a lot of you do that. I read the blog, and I think it's actually pretty good. It's not self-righteous. It's pretty good. And you're going to learn a lot more. And you're going to learn when people take it the wrong way and so forth. And those will be your best lessons when people come back and say you did this, and you'll learn how to do it better. And you'll also learn that no matter how well you do it, there will be people that take offense each time, and you just have to You have to, go to bed with the knowledge that you did the best you can, that you did it with grace and not, not hate and so forth, not acrimony, and that that if you had to do it over, you would do it the same way, or that you made an honest mistake and so forth. And if you can, you can live with yourself that way, you'll do well. And other people might later on come to you and say, when you said that, it made an effect. Look at the shows. I mean, any of you watch the shows on interventions. I mean, I came from in our family we had what we called practicing alcoholics and non-practicing alcoholics. And that's a tough world for people, And when you confront them and say, guess what, you drink too much, do you think most of them say, you're right, help me get off of this? No, they scream and rail. And you watch any of the interventions, it's tragic. The people that love the most try the hardest, but they do succeed sometimes, not right away. And then people later on will realize, that you were doing it for them. And as you do it, and as you continue to learn, you will learn from the people you write for, and you will learn by the formal essays you live, and you will learn in your own life, from your romantic lives to later when you marry and have to seeing other people in your family marry, to looking at your parents a different way. When I was young, I didn't really think marriage was such a big deal. I mean, I always wanted to be married. I always wanted to have kids and so forth. And now, just at my age, I'm 53 or about to be 53, I'm going out to this school to give a speech, and I looked at a picture of all the graduates, and there are people in 50, 60, and 70-year marriages with their wives. And I look at that and I say, what an achievement that is. And I never would have said that at your age. I just wouldn't have thought about it. But people like that have lived through a lot, and now it's much more of a challenge than it was before.
All right, let's
Anything?
all thank